essentially it follows more or less of a big band format. I'm not going to do any arrangements of standards in this album. It's all going to be originals, and in thinking about it and working on an album like this, it's been quite a number of years since I did all originals, and I remembered some of the albums that I enjoyed when I was young, and things that inspired me a lot. And I thought I would share with you some of the things that, if you haven't heard them, you should. The first one I think that comes to my mind was Miles Ahead with Gil Evans and Miles Davis. At the time I was working in New York, and I knew Gil Evans, and I had met Miles a couple of times, but the extraordinary thing about that record, in addition to the fact that it was one of the most creative records ever made in jazz, but to me it was the time in New York, it was the players, it was the way they understood how to play Gil's music, and it was this incredible feeling in New York at that time. I can't tell you how many wonderful players were there at the same time. And it truly was a unique moment in the history of jazz in that period in New York. It always kind of was the standard for me, anyway, of how to use a soloist in a very personal and unique way with an ensemble. And I continued to try to not necessarily duplicate or imitate that, but use that as a kind of a benchmark of how a soloist can perform in a very indigenous, creative way with an ensemble. So I used that approach in a lot of the movie scores I did, where I would cast soloists almost the way a director would cast actors. It wasn't so much it was the sound of the flute, for example, it was the sound of who played the flute. So, for example, I used Hubert Laws on a couple of music scores because for films, because he had this wonderful, and still does, virtuose, unique way of approaching the flute, and essentially brings to the flute kind of what Miles brought to the trumpet. I mean, you know immediately it's Hubert Laws. There were other examples of this. An album that was not, I don't think it was all that widely distributed. It's on Columbia Records, I know it was, but it was Michel Legrand in his early days came to New York, and he was in his early 20s, and he made an album called Legrand Jazz, and he featured Miles Davis, Ben Webster, some of the great New York jazz musicians of the period, and it was the most impulsive and musical and exciting jazz records I've ever heard. And it was, there again, it was this same time in New York with a lot of the same musicians, and he was just like a kid in the candy store when he came to New York and got to make an album with these musicians, and the exuberance of it all is just absolutely spectacular. It was another big band album that really inspired me. We used to call it the Atomic Bomb album because we didn't know, it was just called Basic. It was all originals by Neil Hefti. The combination of his arranging techniques and his tunes and the way it fit the Basie approach, the Basie band, was just it was unbelievable. It was such a fusion of perfection in terms of the way Hefti and Basie, the band, just absolutely were one and the same. I mean, he, to me, helped really define that whole sound of the Count Basie band. And there were other great arrangers, Ernie Wilkins and some of the rest, but there was something about those Neil Hefti things that were just so perfect. And that was a wonderful inspiration to me, and I always thought, God, if I could ever get a chance to write for the Basie band, because of what Neil had essentially done. There was another wonderful band of that period that was rather short-lived, but I remember going to the Village Vanguard a number of times and seeing them in person, and it was Jerry Mulligan. Here again, it was this New York period of these musicians, Clark Terry, Nick Travis, Bobby Brookmeyer, Phil Woods, Zoot Sims, Al Cohn, Mel Lewis playing drums, Bill Crow. I mean, all these legendary musicians who were all interacting with each other all the time. Every time you saw them, it was kind of different from the last time because they took a lot of chances and they do things and stretch things and all that. It was a wonderfully musical band. You should definitely check out the Jerry Mulligan Concert Jazz Band. The big band that I heard when I was a kid, I would go to the Roseland Ballroom in New Haven, Connecticut on Sundays because the big bands would stop off on Sunday nights. The Ritz Ballroom. Roseland was New York. It was the Ritz Ballroom in Bridgeport. That's where it was, not New Haven. And, people would dance and all of that, but they had this walkway so I could go around. If you wanted to go to the bathroom, you had to go around behind the band, and there was this catwalk. And I could stand at the catwalk and put my head kind of forward, and I was almost in the trumpet section because the band was facing that way. And I could fantasize like I was playing with Woody Herman or Count Basie. Oh, they all came through, Stan Kenton. The album of Woody Herman's called The Third Herd. I played that record, I don't know, thousands of times. Woody had a number of herds, but The Third Herd, the personnel and the combination of the arranging and the personnel of that band made a huge impression upon me. The other things that were kind of going along similarly were classical music, because I played the trumpet, and I played in symphony orchestras, and I played in jazz bands, so I always kind of had a two-tiered kind of experience. There were certain composers along the way that really intrigued me. One was a Japanese composer named Turo Takemitsu, November Steps. He took the most famous shakuhachi player in Japan and sat him on a kind of a blanket in front of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And he had a tabla player and this shakuhachi player, and what he did was feature something that was so, in a way, foreign to an instrument that would be featured with a symphony orchestra. And it inspired me to write a number of pieces for jazz elements and symphony orchestra. If I hadn't heard this November Steps, I would have probably not felt that it could work, because at the time we were doing some of these things, people were telling me, oh, you're out of your mind, it'll just never happen. But they were wrong. It did happen, and now it's rather commonplace. There are a lot of young musicians who are extremely versatile in terms of writing for orchestras and bands and all the rest. But in 30 years ago, that wasn't so much the case. Early Stravinsky, pieces like The Firebird and The Rite of Spring and all that, they made an enormous impression upon me. I remember Roger Kellaway, who's a wonderful pianist. He called me and he said, look, I found these piano rolls that Stravinsky thought he could make a little bit of money in piano rolls. And if you ever want to hear a real orchestration lesson that you would never imagine getting, it's to hear The Firebird played with 4 hands on a piano, because you really hear the nuts and bolts of all of that, of what he was really doing. And then you compare that to this unbelievably brilliant orchestration, and it really gives you an insight into his mind and the materials and the way he used things. It's an incredible experience. The classical piece, I think, that most got to me in terms of the sound of it and the transparency of it was the Adagios for Strings by Samuel Barber. I first heard that piece when I was about 18 years old, and the reason I heard it was because we'd gone to a concert of the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, and the conductor, or the associate conductor, had a heart attack. And so instead of playing the first piece that was scheduled because he had died, they played the Adagio for Strings. And I can't recall ever being more moved with any piece of music than that. It was an incredibly moving experience, but it also taught me how to kind of think about strings in terms of the transparency and the contrapuntal approach to the string section that served me well for the last 40 years. That leads to the next piece that I always absolutely adored, The Bad and the Beautiful by David Raxon. If you don't know that piece of music, immediately go out and get it. It's an absolutely exquisite piece of music. I couldn't resist a friend of mine and a mentor of mine when I got to Los Angeles and started doing a lot of movies and stuff. Was a wonderful orchestrator out here named Herb Spencer. And Herb was really like a second father to me. he was the age that my father would be, and he orchestrated some of the movies I did when I first came out here. He showed me a lot of things. He also orchestrated everything that John Williams did. I mean, all those big movies. He was a great musician, and he was, let's see, he was really up in his late 80s and early 90s, and he was still working, but he got Parkinson's, and I would go to lunch with him every week, and he was getting a little more frail and all that. He knew that, and I would take him home. And he had lived in Westwood, an apartment in Westwood, and so one day I'm taking him home, and he says, "Come on in here. I want you to have something." And he brought me into the living room, and he went up on the shelf and he pulled out a book, and he says, "I want you to have this." And it was one of the very first copies of Porgy and Bess by George Gershwin, with a personal note to her from George Gershwin in it, and I have that in my library right here. And Porgy and Bess was a huge inspiration to me anyway, and it's just one of my most treasured possessions. But I think the music of George Gershwin made a huge impact, not only on me, of course, but it was because of the really American flavor of it all, and the almost audacity of all that talent, and I mean, it was an extraordinary time. So anyway, I thought I would share some of that with you. I hope you'll stick with me through the process of this new album, and I'll check up with you soon.